Hello, this is Jasmine's Money Podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles and I'm joined by the political journalist Paul Osborne. It's the month of May and we're talking about how to make money and save money. But in particular, this month, the big topic is Brexit. And as, Paul, you are a political journalist, I know this is what you eat, drink and sleep all day.
I'm in the unusual position of being somebody who is interested in and excited by the debate about the European Union, which puts me in, I would think, a very, very small minority.
Yeah, less than 1%, I would say.
Yeah.
So I have some questions of my own and some from readers about the Brexit debate. I think a lot of people, and I include myself in this, who are like, oh, for goodness sake, I am now getting a bit agitated about it. And I think partly because there are such strong feelings we're seeing on both sides and, frankly, so few actual facts. So I thought we could see if we could pick out a few numbers, a few possible facts, and it's some maybe definites, as well as the, well, it's likely to, or this might happen, or, you know, we're afraid that. And to start off with, you know, a question a lot of people kind of have, although they're not really asking it in actual words, is what are going to happen to our jobs? What's going to happen to jobs? Will there be more jobs or fewer jobs if we come out of Europe?
Now, while I'm happy to help, I am, as you say, a political journalist, and so I am bound by the rules of impartiality. So my aim is that by the end of this, you have no idea what I'm going to do on referendum day, which way I'm going to vote. So what happens to jobs? Well, if you listen to the people who are campaigning for us to stay in the EU, they say we will lose a significant proportion of jobs. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of jobs could go when we were not in the European Union. Their view is that when you're in the European Union, you're in this massive free trade group. So you can manufacture something anywhere in Britain and you can export it to anywhere in any of the other 27 EU member states with no difficulties and no tariffs. If you weren't in the EU, you'd have to renegotiate a new trade deal, either with the whole of the EU or with those individual countries. What if you're a company that has decided to set up its European headquarters in London or in Birmingham or in Edinburgh, and now suddenly you're outside the European Union? You find yourself, if you want to trade with France, Germany, Italy, you're in the wrong place. So the Remain camp would say some of those companies will decide to leave. And the very uncertainty at the moment that we don't know whether we're going to stay or go means that some of those companies may be delaying investment decisions, maybe pondering whether or not those jobs should stay in the UK, whether maybe they want to set up their headquarters in France or in Spain. The financial services sector, which is a massive part of the London economy, say the Remain camp is because we're part of the EU. If we're no longer part of the EU, why would London be Europe's financial capital? Why wouldn't it necessarily be Frankfurt? Turn the coin over, and the people who say that we should leave the EU would say that companies have been held back by EU red tape, by regulations, what they can and can't do. Therefore, freed of all of that, you would be free to innovate. You would be free to innovate free of European regulation. You would be free to sell to other countries. The big emerging markets aren't in the European Union, India and China. There are lots of other opportunities that we should be exploring. Fundamentally, all of these questions come down to this thing. The exit campaigners say if we left the EU, then obviously the EU would be desperate to do a trade deal with Britain because we are the world's fifth biggest economy. The Remain campaigners say you don't know how long it would take. You don't know what conditions will be placed on it. And most countries that have done trade deals with the EU have had to accept lots of the things that the EU demands, like free movement of individuals, no border controls. The example that everyone gives is Norway. Norway is not in the EU but has a free trade deal with the EU. The Norwegian government did a report several years ago that said that as a consequence of this, Norway effectively is run by the European Union because in order to have access to that market, they have to accept the EU's conditions. And so they've become what they call a fax democracy, which means that it gets instructions from Brussels that it must obey in order to maintain that trade deal. It doesn't, however, get a say on those. So the Remain campaigners would say, if you're inside the EU, you're at the table, you get to have a say in what those rules are. If you're outside, You just get told what the rules are and you have to stick to them.
So you've already answered one of the questions that I had, which is what would happen to the city? It does seem, certainly as far as the Remain camp is concerned, we would effectively lose it. And I have heard that a lot of the big banks, possibly all of them, have already had discussions about what they would do, where they would go if we came out of Europe, apparently. But what would happen to farmers?
Well, one of the most famous / infamous things about the European Union is the common agricultural policy. On the one hand, that's seen lots of money coming into farmers in subsidies from the EU. But on the other hand, it's seen them for years, decades, paid to grow crops that will then be destroyed, or paid to not grow crops on their land, the set-aside payment. And ultimately, the exit campaigners would say, mean that control over Britain's farming industry doesn't belong to Britain anymore. It belongs to Brussels, who get to say what you grow, how much you grow of it, and how much you get paid for it. They would say, freed of the European Union, farmers will be able to run their farms as their own business and make their own decisions without somebody in another country telling them what to do. What it wouldn't do is change the fact that those farmers need to sell to the big supermarkets, and the supermarkets, as with milk, say, might decide they want to pay the farmer less than it's costing them to produce it. So whether it would necessarily dramatically improve the circumstances of the farming industry, I think is a bit of a moot point.
It reminds me, you're talking about the milk industry. I know in this country, the supermarkets have been down on the farmers so much that a lot of dairy farmers are just giving up because they simply can't make money out of the milk. And what I have heard is that if we come out of Europe and sort of European employment laws, it's likely that it's going to be harder for employees. We're going to be very much more on the side of bosses.
Well, the government has talked in the past about wanting to change some of the employment laws. So unions would say that they're trying to water down some of the protections that employees have. The government says what it's trying to do is make the economy more business friendly, and that if you do that, then actually you create more jobs. Now, of course, a lot of those protections come from European laws and European conventions that we may or may not be subject to. The problem with this whole debate is there are so many things that we just don't know. We don't actually know what the process of leaving the European Union will be like until we tried to leave the European Union. So on the one hand, we have people who are saying everything will be amazing. You would wake up, the sun will be shining, it will be warmer, everyone will be happier because we would no longer be under the yoke of Brussels. And then you have other people saying, oh, you don't know though, do you? You know, maybe you'd lose your job. Do you want to risk it? And so it does come down, I think, to a feeling. Like a lot of elections, fundamentally, it does come down to how do you feel about this? The polls so far seem to suggest that people, generally speaking, aren't keen on the EU. They don't love it, but they're quite worried about what life will be like outside. And that seems to be putting the Remain camp in front. It's got a lot closer during the campaign. Barack Obama's intervention didn't help particularly. And the polls that were done after the president intervened in the debate showed that the Leave camp had gone up a little bit and narrowed the gap. Whether that's because people were taking against an outsider coming and telling us what to do, though I suppose fundamentally that's what the European Union is, it's quite close. But I don't know how much of this comes down to hard political facts and how much of it just comes down to how you feel about Europe.
Yeah, very good point. And, you know, when it comes to, as you say, hard political facts, one area that we never really think about in this country is the expats. There are a lot of expats in Spain, in France, in Italy. If we came out, would they have to come home? Would they get their pensions and healthcare?
Well, we think that what would happen is that the expats will be allowed to stay in those countries in the same way that the people who had come to Britain exploiting the freedom of movement rules that currently exist wouldn't all be kicked out suddenly on the day that we left the European Union. But again, all of these things are open to negotiation. There is a thing you will hear over and over again between now and the 23rd of June called Article 50. Article 50 is the section of, I think, the Lisbon Treaty of the European Union. Don't worry, this doesn't last very long. It's when you basically say, I'm leaving. It's the equivalent of in a marriage, someone packs their bag and walks, announces their intention to walk out. And then, of course, you have the lengthy process of negotiating the divorce. So when you invoke that article and say, we're leaving, you then have 2 years to negotiate the terms of your departure from the EU. Now, under the rules, at the end of those 2 years, whether or not you've negotiated a satisfactory deal, that's it, you're out. The Remain campaigners have said, well, it would take far longer than that. Such a complex series of negotiations that it would take 10 years or more to negotiate our exit. We had Barack Obama saying if Britain wants to negotiate its own separate trade deal with the US, that's a 10-year process. The Leave campaigners say no country of the size of Britain has ever done this, and that they need us, they, the European Union, need us just as much, if not more, than we need them. And so that's why they say we do this quickly. The EU will be very keen to do a deal with us. They wouldn't want to cut themselves off from the world's fifth biggest economy.
Well, yeah, on that point, in a way, the how much they need us. The big issue, it seems to me, and this is my issue, not so much ones from readers, is if we left, would that mean that other countries would leave? Would that lead to the breakup of the EU? One
of the arguments is that actually the European Union might drive a really, really hard punishing bargain with Britain, because they may well not only want to punish the UK for leaving, but they may well want to send a message to everybody else that it's not easy, that it's not painless, that it's difficult, and that there's a price to be paid if you leave, because they don't want half a dozen other countries immediately saying, oh, yeah, no, we'll have a bit of that as well.
That's what I'd do, frankly.
They will be very keen to make sure that no other countries tried to do this.
So, overall, when it comes down to it, do you think it is really, this vote is going to be done on emotion more than facts, purely because nobody has any real facts?
What's interesting about the emotion side of it is, and this is the thing about referendums generally, is that most of the emotion tends to be on one side. If you think back to the Scottish referendum, the people who are campaigning for Scottish independence were able to say how great life would be in an independent Scotland. And they had a message of hope. Their message was about hope and optimism and about how great things would be. And the people who are campaigning to stay in the UK, their message was fear. It was fear of the unknown, fear of what might happen. And we've seen that happen again in the European Union debate. The exit campaigners are the people who are pushing the hope message. Britain would be a better country, stronger, independent, able to do what it wanted. And the Remain camp is using the fear argument. Every household will be £4,300 worse off. You might lose your job. We might be frozen out of vital markets. It's all might be, could be, maybe. But that fear thing tends to work. And historically, if you look at referendums over time, the don't knows, who are the vital people in this, tend to break 2-1 for the status quo. If it's like a general election, if you're not really sure which of the two main parties you prefer, you will probably stick with the one in power rather than the untried opposition. That sort of leads you to think that the Remain camp might be in a stronger position. But those people who are saying they're going to vote to stay in the EU are not going to march grandly down the street, proudly, shouting their intention to vote to stay in an institution that I'm not that keen on, but it's better than the unknown. People who are passionate about leaving the European Union are really passionate about it, which means they are certain to vote. So the 40% or so who've said, I'm voting to leave, you can bet they're going to turn out and vote on the day. The challenge for the Remain campaigners, it's so much less passionate, a bit more apathetic, is making certain that people actually turn out and vote on the 23rd of June, because it's a much weaker proposition.
Particularly the youth, because apparently youth are more pro-Europe, but they're less likely to vote.
Well, look at the last general election, and this is why Labour completely got the general election wrong. This is how the Conservatives won. The Labour Party had a huge lead among young people, 2-1 over the Conservatives. The problem is that only 40% of young people bothered to vote. The Conservatives had a 2-1 lead among people over the age of 65, and 80% of them turned out to vote. And that's why they won, and that's why Labour lost. It's also why we got the polls wrong, because we kept bumping into all these 25-year-olds going, I'm going to vote Labour. And what we forgot to ask them was if they were actually going to bother to vote. It is a real issue for the Remain camp that they will be focusing on in I hate to say this to you, the second half of the campaign, is motivating their supporters very hard to motivate people when your primary motivational factor is fear.
Well, on that happy note, Paul, thank you so much for that. Really useful to hear about that. This has been the Jasmine's Money podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles. I run moneymagpie.com. You can find our newsletter on moneymagpie.com, and you can hear the podcast on Money Magpie and on our YouTube channel. You can get money tips from me on Twitter at Jasmine, and you can get political ideas from Paul Osborne on his Twitter feed, which is at Paul Osborne. Have a listen next month when we're going to be talking about how to make money and save money in June.